Helen Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a small town nestled in the American South, where the air smelled of honeysuckle and the summers stretched long and lazy across the hills. She came into the world healthy, bright-eyed, and full of the kind of energy that makes parents smile without even knowing why. Her father, Arthur Keller, was a captain who had served in the Confederate Army, and he ran a small newspaper in town. Her mother, Kate Adams Keller, was a warm, graceful woman who loved her daughter with the fierce, quiet devotion that only mothers truly understand. For the first 19 months of her life, Helen was just like any other baby, laughing, reaching for things, beginning to mimic sounds, beginning to discover the enormous, colorful world around her. And then, everything went dark. In February of 1882, when Helen was just a year and a half old, she was struck by an illness that the doctors of the time described as acute congestion of the stomach and brain. Some historians now believe it may have been scarlet fever or perhaps meningitis. Nobody knew for certain. What they did know was that when the fever finally broke, something irreversible had happened. Helen Keller could no longer see, she could no longer hear, and because she could not hear, she would soon lose the words she had only just begun to learn to say. In the space of one terrible illness, the entire sensory world that most of us take completely for granted was taken away from a little girl who had only barely begun to taste it. Now, here is where most stories would turn tragic. Here is where most people would expect a story of suffering, of limitation, of a life defined entirely by what was missing. But Helen Keller's story does something extraordinary, something that still stops people in their tracks more than 100 years later. Instead of becoming a story about darkness, it became one of the most luminous, most triumphant, most deeply human stories ever written. And the reason it became that, the reason you are listening to this right now, is because of what happened when one remarkable young woman named Anne Sullivan walked through Helen's door and refused to give up. But let us not rush ahead. Let us sit for a moment in those early years, because understanding what Helen experienced as a child, before Anne arrived, is essential to understanding just how breathtaking her transformation truly was. After the illness, the world Helen lived in was one of complete and absolute silence and darkness. Imagine, if you can, waking up every single day and having no language. Not just being unable to speak, but having no words at all inside your mind, no labels for the things you touch, no names for the people you love, no way to express what you need, what you feel, what you want, what hurts, what delights you. You exist in a world of pure sensation with no way to organize it, no way to share it, no bridge between your inner world and everyone else's. That was Helen's reality. She was not stupid. She was not absent. She was intensely, vividly alive inside, and she knew it, and the frustration of not being able to communicate that aliveness was something she carried in her small body like a storm that had nowhere to go. She developed her own rudimentary signs to communicate basic needs. She would pull someone toward the refrigerator when she was hungry. She would mimic putting on glasses when she wanted to talk about her father. She would stroke her own cheek when she meant her mother. She had invented a small private language of gesture and touch, and within that tiny vocabulary she lived. But it was not enough, not nearly enough for a mind as hungry and as restless as hers. She admits, in her own memoir, that she was a difficult child during these years. She was prone to violent outbursts, kicking and screaming and throwing herself on the floor in fits of fury when she could not make herself understood. The people around her pitied her deeply, and that pity expressed itself in a kind of soft, aching permissiveness. Nobody wanted to discipline her. Nobody wanted to add sadness to what already seemed like a life full of sadness. And so she was allowed to do largely as she pleased, reaching into people's plates at the dinner table, grabbing things from others' hands, ruling the household with the unintentional tyranny of someone who has never been told no in a language they could understand. Her parents were loving people, but they were also lost. They did not know how to reach her. They did not know if she could be reached. There were some in the community who suggested she should be institutionalized, that she could never live any kind of meaningful life, that she was beyond help. The word they used was not kind, and we will not repeat it here, but the sentiment was clear enough. They had written her off. They had looked at this little girl, fierce and wild and locked inside her own silence, and they had decided, in their limited understanding, that there was no key to that particular door. Helen's mother refused to accept that verdict. Kate Keller was the kind of woman who, when told something was impossible, immediately began looking for the way to make it possible. She had read about Charles Dickens's visit to America decades earlier, and in particular about a deaf-blind woman named Laura Bridgman, who had been educated at the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston. If Laura Bridgman could be taught, Kate thought, then so could her daughter. She took Helen to see a specialist named Dr. J. Julian Chisholm, who in turn recommended they consult with Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who had devoted much of his life to working with the deaf community, largely because his own wife and mother had been deaf. Bell met with Helen and was immediately moved by her. He told her parents to write to the Perkins Institution in Boston and ask for a teacher, and the Perkins Institution sent them Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan was 20 years old when she arrived in Tuscumbia, Alabama, on April 3, 1887. She was almost blind herself, having suffered from a severe eye condition since childhood that had already required multiple surgeries, and she had grown up in circumstances that were, in their own way, as hard as anything Helen had faced. Anne had spent years in a state poorhouse after her mother died and her father abandoned her and her younger brother Jimmy. She and Jimmy had been sent to a place called the Tewksbury Almshouse when Anne was 8 years old, a place notorious for its brutal conditions. Jimmy died there not long after they arrived. Anne survived, but the experience left scars both visible and invisible that she would carry her entire life. What Anne Sullivan brought with her to Tuscumbia was not just a teaching method. She brought something harder to define and more important, a refusal, bone deep and absolute, to believe that any human being was beyond the reach of love and language. She had been a student at Perkins herself, had read everything available about Laura Bridgman, and had studied the manual alphabet, a system of spelling words into the hand with finger-spelled letters. She arrived with a plan, but more than a plan, she arrived with a stubbornness that matched Helen's own, and a warmth that was, in its quiet way, as fierce as her will. The first weeks were a battle. Helen describes them honestly and without self-pity in her memoir. Anne tried to teach her, finger-spelling words into Helen's hand, and Helen mimicked the shapes without understanding what they meant. She was imitating, not learning. The difference between those two things, imitation and comprehension, was the entire world, and bridging it seemed, in those early weeks, nearly impossible. There was also the matter of discipline. Anne understood immediately that Helen's behavior had to change before learning could happen. You cannot teach a child who has never learned that other people's needs matter too. And so Anne began insisting on manners, on sitting properly at the table, on using utensils, on basic social behaviors that the household had long since stopped enforcing. This brought her into direct conflict with Helen's father and, more painfully, with her mother, who found it almost impossible to watch Anne correct Helen firmly when everything in them wanted to give the child whatever she wanted, just to ease her suffering. Anne won those battles, partly because she was right, and partly because she insisted on a 2-week period where she and Helen lived together in a small garden cottage away from the main house, so that Helen could not run to her mother every time Anne set a boundary. In that cottage, something began to shift. Without the safety valve of parental indulgence, Helen began to learn that the world had rules, and within those rules, slowly, something like trust began to grow between the wild little girl and the young woman who refused to give up on her. And then came the moment that Helen Keller would later describe as the most important day of her life, the day she was born again. It was April 5, 1887. Anne took Helen to the water pump in the garden. She held Helen's hand under the cold running water, and with her other hand, she finger-spelled WATER into Helen's palm. She had done something like this before, many times, without it breaking through, but this time something different happened. Something clicked, something ignited. Helen understood. Not just the word water, not just that this particular sensation had a name, but the entire concept itself, the staggering, world-shattering realization that everything has a name, that language exists, that there is a bridge between the private world inside her and the shared world outside her, and that bridge is made of words. She writes about this moment with a rawness and a joy that is still, more than a century later, difficult to read without feeling it move through you. She dropped to the ground and touched the earth and asked for its name. She touched the pump and asked for its name. She turned to Anne and asked for the name of the thing Anne was, and Anne spelled TEACHER into her hand, and from that day forward, Helen never called her anything else. She called her teacher, always, for the rest of her life. In the hours that followed the water pump miracle, Helen learned 30 words, 30, in one afternoon. Because now she was not imitating, she was learning. Now she understood what language was for. Now every word was not a meaningless sequence of finger positions but a doorway. And she walked through every single one of them with the hunger of someone who has been kept from food for years and has suddenly been invited to a feast. In the days and weeks and months that followed, the transformation was staggering. Helen learned to read raised print, then Braille. She learned to write, first with a grooved board that kept her pencil in line, then with a normal pencil, and finally on a typewriter. She learned to read the lips, or rather, the throat and lips, of people who spoke, by placing her fingers delicately on their face and feeling the vibrations of their words, a method called Tadoma. She devoured books the way some people devour air. She read everything she could get her hands on. She read history and poetry and science and fiction. She read Shakespeare. She read the Bible. She read Greek mythology. She read Charles Lamb and Oliver Wendell Holmes and countless others, and she absorbed them, and they became part of the voice she was slowly, painstakingly developing. Language for Helen was not just communication, it was life itself. It was the thing that made her real to herself. She writes in her memoir about the difference between the world before words and the world after words, and it is like reading about two entirely different people. Before words, she existed. After words, she began to live. Anne Sullivan was with her through all of it, spelling books into her hand, guiding her through lessons, pushing her when she needed pushing, holding her when she needed to be held. One of the most extraordinary bonds in the history of human beings. Not sentimental in the way people sometimes make it sound, but real and complicated, and layered with the same tensions and devotions that exist in any deep relationship between two very strong-willed, very intelligent people. Helen was 9 years old when she made a decision that would shape the next several years of her life. She wanted to learn to speak. Not just to fingerspell, not just to read Braille, but to speak aloud, with her own voice the way hearing people did. This was considered by many to be wildly, almost cruelly, ambitious. Deaf-blind people did not speak. The sounds required for speech are learned, in ordinary children, by hearing and imitating. Helen had never heard a word in her life since she was 18 months old. The muscles involved in speech, the lips, the tongue, the soft palate, require constant auditory feedback to develop normally. Teaching Helen to speak seemed, to many experts, like asking someone to paint a picture they could never see. Helen did not care what seemed possible. She went to Sarah Fuller, the principal of the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston, and she began. She learned to feel the position of Sarah Fuller's lips and tongue and throat as each sound was made, and then she replicated those positions with her own face. The work was painstaking beyond description. Each individual sound took hours and hours of practice. The sounds once learned had to be combined into words. The words, once formed, had to be practiced again and again until they bore some resemblance to recognizable speech. She succeeded. Not perfectly, not in the sense that her voice was easy for strangers to understand, but she spoke. She used her voice. And the satisfaction she took in that, the pride and the joy she felt at having pushed through something that most people told her was impossible, radiates off every page of her memoir whenever she mentions it. At around the 10-minute mark of Helen's story, it becomes important to pause and just sit with what has already happened. A child who was locked in total silence and darkness, who had no language, who was considered uneducable and perhaps institutionalizable, had learned to read, to write, to speak, to communicate with the world. In under 10 years. With the help of one extraordinary teacher and her own extraordinary will. This is not a fairy tale. This is documented. This happened. And it happened because two people refused, absolutely and categorically, to accept a story that ended in limitation. If you are listening to this and there is something in your own life that people have told you is beyond your reach, something you have been warned is too hard or too late or simply not meant for you, I want you to hold Helen Keller's story in your hands for a moment. Not as an inspiration poster, not as a motivational quote, but as evidence, as proof that the human spirit, when it is paired with the right support and the unbreakable decision to keep going, is capable of things that look, from the outside, like miracles. And if you are finding value in this summary, if Helen's story is moving something in you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it helps more stories like this one reach more people who might need to hear them. Every subscription is a vote for more of this. Thank you, truly. Now, back to Helen. She was 11 years old when a controversy arose that would follow her, unfairly and cruelly, for many years. She had written a short story called The Frost King, and submitted it as a gift to Michael Anagnos, the director of the Perkins Institution. The story was praised and published. And then someone noticed that it bore a striking resemblance to a story called The Frost Fairies, written by a woman named Margaret T. Canby. The similarity was so close that accusations of plagiarism were raised, and a formal investigation was conducted, with Helen, at 11 years old, sitting before a panel of adults who questioned her about whether she had deliberately copied another person's work. The investigation concluded that she had not done so intentionally. What had most likely happened was that someone had read her The Frost Fairies years earlier. She had absorbed it completely, as her extraordinary memory was wont to do, and when she later wrote The Frost King, she had no conscious awareness that she was reproducing something she had read. The experience was, by her own account, devastating and humiliating. She became terrified of her own writing for years afterward, second-guessing every phrase, wondering whether anything she thought was original was actually borrowed from something she had read and forgotten reading. What is remarkable about how she handles this episode in her memoir is the honesty with which she confronts it. She does not make excuses. She does not deflect. She examines it with the same clear-eyed, generous intelligence she brings to everything else, and she concludes that the experience, as painful as it was, taught her something important about the relationship between reading and writing, about how deeply the books we absorb shape the thoughts we think we are originating. She concludes that all writers are in some sense vessels for everything they have read, and that originality is not the absence of influence but the particular way a particular mind absorbs and transforms what it takes in. That is a sophisticated and generous conclusion for anyone to reach. For an 11-year-old who had just been publicly humiliated, it is breathtaking. Helen continued her education with characteristic intensity. She studied at the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, preparing for college. The experience was difficult in ways that had less to do with her disabilities and more to do with the institution's lack of preparedness for a student like her. Most of the materials she needed were not available in Braille. Anne had to attend every class with her, finger-spelling the lectures into her hand in real time, simultaneously reading aloud from textbooks that Helen could not access independently. The physical and mental demands on Anne during these years were extraordinary, and they took a measurable toll on her already fragile eyesight. Helen was not always an easy student. She was stubborn and she was proud, and there were subjects, particularly mathematics, that she found genuinely difficult and frustrating. She does not pretend otherwise in her memoir. She is not the kind of writer who smooths her experience into an inspirational narrative where everything becomes triumph. She writes about struggling. She writes about discouragement. She writes about the days when the work seemed impossible and the progress seemed invisible. And she writes about pushing through anyway, not with cheerful ease, but with the kind of grinding, teeth-gritted determination that is less photogenic than triumph, but more honest. She was accepted to Radcliffe College, the women's college affiliated with Harvard, in 1900. She was the first deaf-blind person ever to attend a college of that caliber. The application process itself was a formidable obstacle, involving examinations in Latin, Greek, German, French, history, and mathematics, none of which were available in Braille, all of which required Anne to translate in real time. She passed, she was admitted, she went. The 4 years at Radcliffe were, by her account, both the most intellectually stimulating and the most physically demanding of her life to that point. Every class required Anne's simultaneous translation. Every assignment required Helen to work twice as hard as her sighted, hearing classmates, simply to access the same material. The typewriter became her constant companion. She typed all her papers, sometimes working late into the night, when the work backed up and the deadlines loomed. She was not always appreciated by her professors the way she deserved to be. There were some who found her presence inconvenient, who had not thought through the practicalities of accommodating a deaf-blind student, and who, rather than problem-solve, simply resented the extra effort involved. There were others who were moved and impressed by her, who recognized that the quality of her thinking and her writing was genuinely exceptional, disability entirely aside. It was at Radcliffe that she began writing the story of my life. She wrote it initially as a series of essays for a magazine called the Ladies' Home Journal, encouraged by a man named John Albert Macy, who was a young editor and writer who helped her organize and refine her material. The essays were published in 1902, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The book version was published in 1903, when Helen was 22 years old. The book is, among many other things, a love letter to language, to the specific, tactile, sensory joy of words. Helen writes about reading the way a musician might write about hearing music, with a reverence and a physicality that makes you feel the texture of the experience she is describing. She writes about running her fingers over braille pages in the dark and feeling the stories rise up to meet her. She writes about the way a well-constructed sentence feels when it passes through her fingertips into her mind, the rhythms of it, the architecture of it, the way some sentences seem to have a weight that others do not. She writes about nature in ways that are quietly astonishing, given that she cannot see it or hear it. She describes the smell of rain approaching over a field, the way the air changes before a storm, the texture of bark under her palm and the particular give of wet grass underfoot, the warmth of sunlight on her face and the cold of shade that follows immediately when a cloud passes. She reads the world through her remaining senses with a precision and an attentiveness that most of us, drowning as we are in visual and auditory stimulation, have never had to develop, and her descriptions of that reading are some of the most beautiful nature writing in the English language. There is a passage in the book where she describes a day spent in a tree. She had climbed up into the branches, which she did often, finding in the elevation and the swaying motion and the complex texture of bark and leaves a kind of joy that she associated with freedom. And while she was up there, a storm came. She felt the tree begin to move before she knew what was happening. She felt the wind through the leaves as a vibration, a sound that came to her not through her ears but through her body. She felt the temperature drop. She felt the bark become slick under her hands, and she climbed down, terrified, exhilarated, laughing. It is a passage that reminds you that this was a real child, with a real child's love of adventure and risk, and the particular sweetness of a scare that ends safely. She also writes about friendship with a tenderness that is easy to overlook in all the focus on her extraordinary intellectual achievements. She had real friends, people who loved her and whom she loved, people with whom she exchanged long, thoughtful letters, people who came to visit and spent hours with her, spelling into her hand and reading to her and laughing with her. She was not isolated, not in the way that people sometimes imagine a deaf-blind person must inevitably be. Language, once she had it, gave her access not just to information but to intimacy. And she used that access fully. She corresponded with some of the most remarkable people of her era. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a friend. Mark Twain was a friend, a devoted and vocal admirer who said some of the most generous and beautiful things about her that anyone has ever said about anyone. He compared her to Napoleon, not physically but in terms of force of character, and said that in his view the two most interesting characters of the 19th century were Napoleon and Helen Keller. Coming from Mark Twain, whose standards for interesting were famously high, that was not a small thing. She also wrote about the things she loved. She loved music, which surprises people who forget that she could feel vibrations, that she could place her hands on a piano or a speaker or a person's throat and feel the rhythm and tone of sound even if she could not hear it in the conventional sense. She wrote about placing her hands on Paderewski's piano while he played, and feeling the music move through the wood and into her palms. She loved theater, which surprises people for similar reasons. She could follow a performance by having someone spell it into her hand, and she found in that experience a kind of translated joy that was not the same as seeing and hearing it directly, but was not nothing either. She loved dogs. She had dogs her entire life and wrote about them with the easy, unconditional warmth that dog people will immediately recognize. She loved the smell of libraries. She loved the smell of the ocean. She loved trees, particularly the ones you could climb. She loved long walks and the particular pleasure of movement through space when you know your body well enough to trust it. She graduated from Radcliffe cum laude in 1904, the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. It is a sentence that still has weight to it even now, more than 120 years later. After graduation, she did not retire into the comfortable obscurity that some might have expected or even encouraged. She became one of the most prominent public figures in America. She lectured across the country and eventually around the world, with Anne always beside her, translating Helen's voice for audiences who could not yet follow it without help. She wrote more books. She became a political activist, which surprised people who had cast her primarily in the role of inspirational symbol, a living reminder that the human spirit can overcome anything. But Helen Keller was not content to be a symbol. She was a thinking, opinionated, politically engaged person who had views about how the world should be organized, and she was not shy about sharing them. She became a socialist. She advocated for workers' rights. She supported women's suffrage. She opposed American involvement in the First World War. She was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union. These positions made some people uncomfortable, people who had preferred her as an uncomplicated inspiration rather than a complicated human being with a political identity. There were newspapers that had praised her work effusively, who suddenly found her less admirable once she began saying things they disagreed with. She addressed this directly and with characteristic directness. She said, and I am paraphrasing here because we do not reproduce exact quotes, that the people who had praised her so generously before she expressed her political views had praised the wrong thing. They had praised her for overcoming her disabilities, for being brave in a way that cost them nothing to admire. But when she began asking for changes that might cost them something, suddenly her judgment was in question, suddenly her conclusions were suspect, and some of them even suggested that perhaps her disabilities impaired her ability to think clearly about the world. She found this not just offensive but revealing. It showed her, she said, that some people want their inspirational figures to be inspiring in ways that do not make demands. She made demands. She kept making them. She lived to 97 years old, one of the most photographed, written about, and talked about people of the 20th century, and she kept making demands until the end. The story of my life ends while Helen is still in college. Still in the middle of the story, she would go on to live for another 6 decades. But what the book captures, in the years it does cover, is something that remains worth sitting with long after you have finished the last page. It captures the specific texture of a consciousness coming into being through language. It captures the miracle, and it is a miracle even if it happened through entirely explicable means, of a mind meeting the world and finding that the world, however difficult, however painful, however much it has withheld from you, is worth meeting. Helen Keller did not pretend that her life was easy. She did not pretend that disability is a gift, or that suffering is secretly a blessing, or any of the other comfortable fictions that people sometimes drape over difficult lives. She was clear-eyed about what had been taken from her, clear-eyed about the work it required to build what she built, clear-eyed about the ways the world failed her and the ways it helped her. But she was also, consistently and without performance, grateful. Grateful for language. Grateful for Anne Sullivan. Grateful for the friends who chose her, and the books that held her, and the trees she could climb, and the music she could feel, and the ocean she could smell, and all the 10,000 small pleasures that her remarkable, attentive, hungry senses gathered for her from a world that many people assumed she could barely access at all. There is a lesson in that gratitude, and it is not the easy lesson, not the one that says count your blessings and be happy with what you have. It is a harder and more interesting lesson, the one that says the world is available to you if you are willing to meet it where it is, rather than where you wish it were. Helen could not hear music the way you hear it. She met it through vibration, through the feel of sound waves moving through wood and air and human flesh, and she found in that meeting a form of joy that was real, that was hers, that was not a consolation prize for something she had lost, but a genuine and particular pleasure in its own right. That is the discipline she modeled, not the discipline of endurance, not the discipline of pushing through pain, though she had those too, but the discipline of attention, of being willing to know the world through whatever channels remain open to you, and of trusting that those channels, however narrow they may seem, are wide enough for joy to pass through. Near the end of her memoir, after years of struggle and learning and growth, after the water pump and the Frost King and Cambridge and Radcliffe, after all the words she had accumulated and all the worlds they had opened for her, Helen writes something that has stayed with readers for over a century. She writes, again paraphrasing here, that she has always thought it would be a blessing if every person could be blind and deaf for a few days early in their life, because darkness would make them more appreciative of sight and silence would teach them the joys of sound. She does not mean this bitterly. She means it as a genuine observation about attention, about how much we fail to see because we have always had eyes, how much we fail to hear because we have always had ears. She had to learn to pay attention because everything depended on it. Most of us never have to learn that, and so we never do, and so we walk through a world full of extraordinary things without really looking at any of them. She was not asking for pity. She was never asking for pity. She was asking, in her quietly radical way, for something harder. She was asking for attention, for presence, for the willingness to be where you are, with the fullness of whatever you have available. She was asking, in other words, for the things she herself had practiced every single day of her life since April 5, 1887, when a young teacher held her hand under cold running water and everything changed. Anne Sullivan lived with Helen for nearly 50 years. She was beside her, translating, supporting, loving, fighting with her, and making up with her, through almost all of it. Anne's eyesight continued to deteriorate throughout her life, and in the end she lost her sight almost entirely, a painful irony that was not lost on either of them. Helen was the one, in those final years, who cared for Anne, who read to her, who sat with her. The woman who had spent decades translating the world for Helen became, in those later years, someone who needed help finding her way through it, and Helen gave her that help without hesitation, without resentment, with the same fierce, uncomplicated love with which Anne had once held her hand at the water pump. Anne Sullivan died in 1936 with Helen holding her hand. Helen lived for another 32 years. She continued to write, to speak, to advocate, to travel, to read, to give. She met every American president from Grover Cleveland, who was in office when she was a child, to Lyndon Johnson. She toured Japan after the Second World War, visiting Hiroshima and meeting survivors of the bombing, an experience that moved her profoundly and deepened her already firm pacifist convictions. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. She was a global figure, translated into dozens of languages, known in countries whose names she had only ever read in Braille, loved by people she had never met and would never meet, and who nonetheless felt that her story had done something for them that mattered. She died on June 1, 1968, in her sleep, at her home in Connecticut. She was 87 years old. The story of my life is not a complete life, but it is a complete argument. An argument for what becomes possible when you refuse to accept the story that other people tell about your limits. An argument for the irreplaceable importance of one good teacher, one person who shows up and decides you are worth reaching. An argument for language, for the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible gift of having words for the world, words that let you reach across the silence between oneself and another and make contact, make meaning, make something real. It is also, perhaps most importantly, an argument for paying attention, for the kind of attention that Helen had to learn because everything depended on it, and that most of us could stand to practice even though for us the stakes are lower. Because the world is full, absolutely full, of things that will reward your attention if you give it. Smells and textures and sounds and tastes, and the particular quality of light at different times of day, and the way people's faces change when they are trying not to cry, and the sound a good sentence makes inside your head when you read it. All of it is there. All of it is available. The only question is whether you are paying attention. Helen Keller paid attention. She paid attention her entire life, with every sense she had, with every word she had learned, with every fiber of the remarkable and extraordinary and entirely human mind that a fever tried to extinguish before it ever really began. She paid attention and she wrote it down and she gave it to us, and here we are, more than 100 years later, still receiving the gift. If her story has done something for you today, if it has reminded you of something you knew and had forgotten, or told you something you needed to hear, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Your support is genuinely what keeps this channel going, what allows us to keep bringing stories like this one to people who need them. Every like, every subscription, every comment where you tell us what this story meant to you, it all matters, it all helps, and we are grateful for every single one. And while you are here, please do explore the rest of our video library. We have summaries and readings of some of the most powerful, most human, most unforgettable books ever written. Books that might change something for you the way Helen Keller's story has changed things for people for over a century. They are there waiting for you, ready to meet you wherever you are. We hope to see you there.